Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to some of you joining us. Welcome to our webinar from global grain disruptions to local reality. Thank you again for joining us today. Before we introduce our speakers, a quick note on housekeeping. If you have questions at any point, please use the Q&A button on your Zoom panel and type them in. We will address these during the Q&A sessions at the end. If we are not able to get to your questions live, we will follow up after the webinar. Today's webinar is hosted by eFeedLink together with S&P Global Energy and EFL Ag Data and sponsored by EW Nutrition. Joining us today are Edward Lau and Vivian Tang from S&P Global Energy covering agriculture and food markets. Together, they will be taking us through feed grain trade dynamics and the current geopolitical backdrops. And Edward will walk us through how their session is structured. Rounding us out is Matthew Clark, who will be taking us through how shifting grain prices are affecting amino acid markets and ingredient value before bringing us the ASEAN ground level view. Without further ado, I will hand it over to Edward and Vivian to get us started. Thank you. Edward, to you.
Hello, thank you, Jonathan. Let me share my screen now. So hi everyone, my name is Edward Lau, and I'm a price reporter for feed grains at S&P Global Platts. Together with my colleague Vivian Tang, we will be presenting on the topic of feed grains dynamics following the start of the Iran war, and in the process cover price changes of corn, a key feed ingredient, trade flow changes for this commodity across 2025 to 2026, and how three factors are extremely important to feed grains prices this year. So before we begin on the content, I would like to explain to our audience about what we as Platts do. We are a price reporting agency that provides two main services. Firstly, day-to-day information on physical commodity markets. And secondly, we provide price assessments on various commodities such as corn, soybeans, and many others. These two services help to increase transparency to the market, and that is where us price reporters come in. We gather information from a wide variety of sources, such as traders, brokers, feed millers, farmers, and many others, and use the information to write our commentaries and assess a fair tradable value for each commodity. So we have a very wide range of market coverage built over many years of research and development. And our assessments extend from the oil and gas industry all the way to agriculture and fertilizers. Vivian and I are part of the Asia Agri and Ferts pricing team, which covers the full field to fork range of commodities as shown in this slide. So some of our key benchmarks are the wheat and rice prices, while others such as beef and corn are climbing in importance for the markets. For today's presentation, we will be covering mainly the grain crops. So that will mean corn, soybeans, and wheat, with some supporting information on the upstream fertilizers and downstream proteins markets. So let us begin from corn, which is arguably the most important raw material for animal feed. In Asia, we have about 8 net corn importers, but there are 4 that are very, very important. By order of the largest to lowest importers, we will start with Japan, followed by Vietnam, and then South Korea, which form the bulk of Asia's corn import volumes. So China is the 4th largest corn importer, but they also have the capacity to import just as much or even more than the previous 3 countries. But since a peak of about 27 million metric tons per year across 2021 to 2023, they have drastically reduced their imports and imported just around 4 million metric tons last year. And there could be even less imports in 2026. So here we can see a comparison between 2025's imports, which is the red bars, and 2026 total imports so far in the black bars, And for some countries, the data extends from January to May, others from January to June. So most countries are following the same pattern of procurement as last year, and their percentage of delivered corn is quite similar to how far we are into 2026. However, some countries in Asia are a bit interesting because they are bucking the trend. So Philippines and Bangladesh have already imported more than 90% of the previous year's volume by the first half of 2026, mainly due to expectations of lower domestic corn production in the Philippines, while Bangladesh is seeing a strong demand from domestic livestock and aquaculture sectors. Meanwhile, Thailand is another interesting standout. They have recently approved imports of US corn, with market participants expecting about 600,000 metric tons to be booked. So far, only one cargo of about 60,000 metric tons has been purchased by Thailand, but there is most likely going to be more booked in the coming weeks. Meanwhile, we are seeing the opposite trend in Indonesia, uh, where feed corn imports are already banned, but food corn is also being restricted even further, and there are increasing layers of import barriers for other feed materials such as soybean meal. But this is generally not the overall trend for the region. Although significant, Thailand, Bangladesh, and the Philippines' higher levels of imported corn is generally not seen as a significant driver of price in the global corn market, as they're only importing about 3 million metric tons of corn between them, out of a total regional demand of above 50 million metric tons. So, what are the key drivers of corn prices then, especially as we move into this post-Iran war era? So, to understand this, we kind of have to look at Platts price assessments, which chart the historical development of spot feed corn imports for CFR Northeast Asia, which has been done since 2016. This assessment is based on clear specifications and methodology, such as a 90 to 120-day forward delivery window, a quality of US number three corn, or the equivalent from any origin such as Brazil and Argentina. And there is a specific Incoterm of CFR South Korea. So as price reporters, we first collect price data points such as bids, offers, and deals from market participants before we derive a price that is below the latest offer, above the latest bid, and as close to the latest deal level that matches the specifications. So sometimes in the absence of some data points that match our specifications, which doesn't happen every day, but it can happen, we will do some normalization by applying a premium or a discount in cases of a differing grade or an Incoterm. So for example, we recently applied a freight spread of $1.50 per metric ton, normalizing a Brazil corn trade from CFR Taiwan to CFR South Korea. So, following my explanation of how we assess the corn price, now let us take a look at the actual changes to this price across 2026 and since 2024. So, at the start of this year, corn prices were highly correlated with the previous year's trend, and it was fluctuating in the range of $240 to $255 per metric ton. However, following the onset of the Iran war on February 28th, prices surged extremely quickly, and it reached a four-year peak of $278 per metric ton CFR in March of 2026. As crude oil prices surged, freight rates also rose due to higher bunker fuel prices, which directly affected CFR destination corn prices. Since then, our assessment has remained higher than the previous year by about $10 to $15 per metric ton, fluctuating in the range of high 250s to high 270s, with declines generally happening whenever a US-Iran peace deal is floated or from some harvest pressure in Argentina and Brazil. So more recently, we have seen prices on an uptrend once again, due to logistics disruptions in the Black Sea, which, although are not directly affecting, the corn exports to Asia, from the Black Sea region, it's still very relevant as the Black Sea is a key supplier of feed wheat. So, however, I would say that the most important factor right now actually is that the factor that drives corn prices is China's return to traditional patterns of buying US soybeans, which I will explain a bit more in a later slide. So in this slide, we can see the changing price competitiveness of various suppliers of corn. And we have this thing called the corn arbitrage price matrix that allows us to see all the major suppliers and their prices. So since July of 2026, we have seen Brazil and Argentina corn become more competitive than the US Pacific Northwest export. And this has been reflected in an increasing number of trades to South Korea and Southeast Asia. So this was not really the trend last year, when US PNW corn was competitive throughout the entire year into most of Northeast Asia and sometimes even into Southeast Asia. So what happened to cause this change? Let's move on to the next slide to understand. So, as earlier mentioned, Brazil and the US are two of the largest producers and exporters of corn and soybeans in the world, while China is the largest importer of soybeans. And this has a significant impact on all three commodity markets. So last year, China reduced its import of US soybeans amidst a tit for tat tariff policy, and only about 12.5 million metric tons of soybeans were sold by the US to China after this agreement was signed in October to reduce tariffs between them. This was significantly lower. This 12.5 million metric tons of soybeans was actually significantly lower than the usual 20 to 30 million metric tons that China usually buys every year from the US. And this has several knock-on effects. So first, Brazil benefited by supplying the bulk of China's soybean demand. They could sell soybeans at a premium with less competition from the US. But this price difference also resulted in some of the exporters favoring soybeans over corn exports. So corn by itself actually was also going more towards Brazilian domestic corn ethanol plants. So that was a situation for South America at the time. Whereas in the US, it shifted from exporting soybeans to exporting more corn instead. So there was almost a 20 million metric tons increase from the 2024 to 2025 season to the current 25-26 season for corn exports, while soybeans saw a reduction of about 10 million metric tons. However, this pattern actually is reversing again. So we are going back into the very traditional pattern of buying before 2025, before the whole geopolitical situation became very extreme when the second Trump administration came in. So actually, what's going on right now is that we are seeing China once again buying large amounts of September and October shipments of US soybeans, and they are set to fulfill a 25 million metric ton commitment agreed between the two countries last year. As of early August, we are seeing almost 92% of September and 68% of October shipments covered by China, with approximately 5.9 million metric tons of US soybeans purchased. And there is still a large amount that's required for November, December, and January, as shown by the black bars. US elevators on the Pacific Northwest have thus decided much of their storage and export capacity to be moved to soybeans instead of corn so that they can service the Chinese markets. And this has also in turn driven up October to December shipment basis levels for US Pacific Northwest corn. And it has made them very uncompetitive into most Asian countries at the moment, as shown in the arbitrage matrix earlier in the slides. So if China continues to purchase US soybeans, it's very unlikely that US corn will remain uncompetitive against Brazilian Argentine corn in the next few months. So this is actually one of the key main factors for the feed grains markets moving into the post-Iran war era. But that is certainly not the last important factor. So before we go into the other important factors, maybe I'd like to first explain what is going on the supply side. So we have a team of analysts behind us who provide information on crop production levels and yields across all the major production countries. So this is a US corn crop production balance sheet. And our analysts are currently seeing a 1.109 billion bushel decline, or about a 28.2 million metric ton drop in production levels for corn, moving into the 2026-27 season. So the previous US corn crop was about 432 million metric tons, upcoming one will be about 404 million metric tons. This decline is due to lower yields and also planted acres that is supported, we kind of they're supported by satellite imagery and some of the crop insurance data. And also because we really can see that there is a higher crop stress levels and elevated abandonment risk in portions of the Western Corn Belt and the plains. So weather has become a very significant driver of production volumes and prices, with persistent warmth and dryness in late July reducing the corn rating to below average. As for the Brazilian crop, our analysts are also seeing a year-on-year decline of about 3 million metric tons from 140 million metric tons to 137 million metric tons. So the reason for the decline is also kind of some impact of El Nino, but also some unfavorable economic conditions. And El Nino will reduce winter corn yields, especially if the soybean crop cycle is delayed and soil moisture proves limited. However, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration forecast actually shows a reduction in the intensity of El Nino from January onward, and that could bring some relief from the dryness and heat. For Argentina's corn crop, it will most likely be another bumper one due to supportive weather conditions arising from El Nino. In 2026, we saw a record 63 to 65 million metric tons of production. While in 2027, we could see a slight decline, but around the same level of 62 million metric tons. These are much higher numbers compared to 3 years before, where production fluctuated from the high 30s million metric tons to around the low 50s. So there are other issues recently, such as the recent Professional Association of River Captains and Pilots, which have caused some concern about operations, but they have been concluded rather quickly without significant impact on the operations and our prices of corn. So some risks continue to be present, however. One of the key factors to look out for looking forward into the next crop will be Argentina's export tax cuts. And this is very important because they could boost competitiveness of its grains and oilseed prices. The government has already published a formal, legally backed schedule that will reduce export taxes over 2027 to 2028. So taxes on soybean exports, currently at 24%, will be cut on a monthly basis throughout 2027, reaching 21% at the end of next year and 15% by the end of 2028. And export taxes for corn, now at 8.5%, will be reduced quarterly by 0.25 percentage points through 2027 and 0.5 percentage points every 3 months of 2028. So eventually reaching 7.5% at the end of 2027 and 5.5% by the end of 2028. So it's a very big change, and this will increase the competitiveness of Argentina's corn prices and other feed grains. So to cap off my section, before I pass on to my colleague Vivian, I will cover the fertilizers market a bit also, as it's not only a key topic, it's one of the, actually I would say it's one of the one of the three most important factors for feed grains markets right now, especially since the onset of the Strait of Hormuz crisis. But this market has also recently come under the purview of Platts agricultural price coverage. So we have brought the price reporters from fertilizer to join us in our agriculture team. So they have also helped me to provide some data and some information. So actually, as you can see on this slide, the Persian Gulf is one of the most important suppliers of urea to the key corn producing countries such as Brazil, US, and even India. However, the timing also matters on whether the fertilizers are applied at specific times in the year. So Brazil's winter export crop will generally see application in January and February, whereas the US is mainly applying fertilizers in March or April for the spring application. So actually in the survey conducted in early April by the American Farm Bureau Federation, a majority of farmers indicated that they were unable to afford the fertilizer they planned on using for spring planting. And results from the same survey also showed that farmers were already adjusting their fertilizer purchase and application decisions in response to the Strait of Hormuz situation. The ongoing supply chain disruption is also likely to affect the planting of major crops, such as corn, soybean, and wheat, with the US Department of Agriculture predicting a reduction in the acreage of nitrogen-hungry corn in favor of soybeans across the country. However, all is not doom and gloom for the fertilizers market. In fact, there are signs that fertilizer supply and trade pathways are developing to make up for the deficit in the Gulf. Firstly, China is stepping up heavily by utilizing a lot of its untapped spare capacity for fertilizer production. So China approved fresh urea export quotas in late May 2026, easing a strict zero export ban imposed in March 2026. And there is a quota of 1.5 million metric tons issued for urea export allocations. Secondly, farmers could also switch from using urea to ammonium sulfate to make up for the nitrogen content. And Brazil in particular has been doing this. Once again, China is at the center of all of this as they are a primary supplier of ammonium sulfate. Hence, the fertilizer situation has not really devolved into a full crisis where no one can find any fertilizer. That's not true. Farmers are still able to retain a significant portion of their yields without increasing costs too significantly. Yeah. So we have some analysts, and they have also provided some scenarios of whether or of how some countries can make up for the fertilizer deficit that is caused by the Persian Gulf situation. So that's my part of the presentation. I will now pass the time over to my colleague Vivian, who will talk about the feed wheat market, downstream proteins markets, and freight logistics.
Okay, thank you very much, Edward. And again, a very good day to everyone on this webinar. So my name is Vivian, and I'm the manager for price reporting for our Asia Pacific agriculture, food, as well as fertilizer coverage. So following the insights shared by Edward on the soybeans and corn markets, as well as some insights into fertilizers, I'll be following up to talk a little bit about where we see feed wheat competing into the Asian markets, how meat demand in Asia could impact the domestic livestock markets and therefore overall feed grain demand, and also the current logistics challenges as a result of not only the US-Iran war, but also the war between Russia and Ukraine. Next slide, please. Oh, okay. Currently, price spreads continue to favor feed corn usage over feed wheat in Southeast Asia. So the chart on your left shows our Platts CFR Northeast Asia corn assessment, and that is plotted against bulk feed wheat trades into North as well as Southeast Asia. For most of this year, you'll see that feed wheat corn spread has remained positive, and in the instances where feed wheat traded close or below feed corn, that was largely due to feed wheat offers from Argentina. So Argentina had a bumper wheat crop in the 25-26 season, much of it being low protein wheat, and that drove Vietnam and Thailand to boost their feed wheat imports from Argentina. Notably, Argentina's wheat exports to Vietnam has jumped about 600% year over year, if you see that chart on the right. This is based on bulk shipments between December to July, using our in-house shipment data from Commodities at Sea. So this jump in shipments can also be observed for Thailand and Indonesia. But for Indonesia, it's important to note that most of this will be going for flour milling purposes. Now, in Vietnam, a robust livestock and aquaculture industry has definitely been supporting that increase in feed grains usage. But with Argentina gradually exiting its typical export window, Asian buyers are left with little competitive origins for feed wheat, and one of them is Australia. So while Australian wheat saw a bigger than expected production for the 25-26 season, it has struggled to compete against cheaper Argentine wheat, especially for the first half of this year. And most of Australia's exports went to the Philippines, where buyers enjoy a tax advantage for Australian origin feed wheat, and were also willing to pay a premium compared to other origins. In fact, Australia was even getting displaced from Japan's feed market, where an abundance of Canadian wheat and also a freight advantage saw Japanese buyers actually putting more Canadian wheat into their feed formulations. As we move ahead, uh, feed wheat will likely continue to struggle to compete into Asian feed markets against corn. Besides the demand window coinciding with the tail end of exports for Australia and Argentina, Black Sea supplies are also more absent from the export market during a time where they should be seasonally dominant. And this is caused by worsening logistical disruptions in recent weeks. We believe these will keep wheat prices relatively firm in the near term and make feed corn a more attractive buy for Asian consumers, except in destinations where there are feed corn import controls. Next slide, please. Yep. So there are, however, some geopolitical factors that might tip the scales in favor of feed wheat. And that is a scenario of high energy prices driven by the US-Iran war. Bullish crude oil markets may favor a diversion of crops into biofuel production compared to exports for better margins, such as ethanol and biodiesel industries, pushing crop prices higher. This would improve the relative price competitiveness of feed wheat, which is a lesser used crop for biofuel production. In fact, this shift toward increasing biofuel production may be structural in certain countries, such as Brazil, where over the past 10 years or so, their consumption of corn for ethanol production has grown from negligible amounts to nearly 24% of total corn production, based on the chart on that right. Now, the US-Iran war has also resulted in more than just higher energy prices. Like what Edward mentioned earlier, the war also significantly disrupted the global fertilizer trade. And we understand that this has resulted in lower fertilizer application in some wheat producing countries, including Australia. The lower use of fertilizers, besides impacting yields, can also affect crop quality, especially protein, if less nitrogen-based fertilizers are used. And this may lead to a higher proportion of low protein feed type wheat in the upcoming new crop harvest. Of course, there is also a strong carryout from multiple wheat exporters that might help to offset lower wheat production concerns in the upcoming harvest, and that will ensure healthy exportable supply. And if consumers in Asia simply prefer to procure their feed grain supplies closer to home, for example, avoiding voyages through more risky routes that pass through the Middle East or the Black Sea, that may also favor feed wheat demand, especially out of Australia. Next slide, please. Now, the feed grain demand picture will not only be impacted by competition between the individual feed crops, but also downstream demand in the livestock sector. And here we'll be highlighting two key markets that are most relevant to the Southeast Asian market, namely pork as well as poultry. We'll start with the pork markets. Here on the left chart, we have two of our global pork assessments. They cover the pork belly prices to North Asia and export prices from the EU, basis Spain. Now, as you can see on the chart, pork prices have been falling over the past 6 months or so, and this is mainly due to heavy oversupplies at destination, especially in Asia. Sources in South Korea and Japan say the oversupply has overwhelmed current storage capacities, making it challenging for them to import more meat despite currently attractive prices. In the Philippines, strong imports have kept pork prices low, which is discouraging domestic hog production. The industry also continues to grapple with African swine fever, which has worsened due to recent wet weather, and farmers are still dealing with higher energy costs and a weak currency, which raises input costs, particularly for a nation that relies on imported feed grains. Other Southeast Asian countries are also not spared from the oversupply situation, and we've heard of several Vietnamese companies abandoning cargoes on arrival as they are suffering losses on imported meat purchases. China, another major pork producer that has recently entered the export market with some chilled pork exports, including to Singapore, is also actively downsizing its hog inventory as pork prices remain depressed in the country. This will very likely weigh on their demand for feed grains in the next 6 months, as they are already in the midst of a supply glut. caused by recent paddy stock auctions and also a domestic wheat harvest that was skewed to lower protein quality. They've also imported high volumes of feed barley and oats and have limited appetite to extend their coverage. Next slide, please. Now, in the chicken markets, we are also observing an oversupply issue similar to pork. On the left-hand side, we have a chart of two of our global poultry assessments covering the boneless chicken leg export prices from Brazil and delivered prices to North Asia, this is Japan. Prices have been quite stable at the start of this year before falling pretty rapidly over the past 3 months, at one point dipping below $2,000 per metric ton CFR, which is a historic low since we launched our suite of chicken assessments. Now, in North Asia, buyers are facing a similar tale of storage constraints versus low import prices. And in fact, pork prices have gotten so low in South Korea that it is even displacing chicken meat demand. In the Philippines, weak demand is driving chicken prices lower, which has created some cash flow issues for importers and resulted in some stuck cargoes at port. As of this week, we've heard as many as 300 containers of frozen meat, including chicken, abandoned at Manila port. And there are talks that these containers could potentially enter government auctions. Now, if we zoom in on the biggest chicken exporter in Southeast Asia, Thailand, they may also experience lower feed grain demand as an unknown disease continues to plague the industry, on top of ongoing heat waves, which has led to nearly 45% drop in weekly slaughter numbers. Fellow exporter Brazil is also looking to lower chicken production as packers find ways to cope with lower export prices. Many packers are heard to be planning reductions of day-old chick placements by about 3 to 5%, and to potentially pivot to more bone-in leg production compared to boneless legs. Next slide, please. Now, at this juncture, it's also impossible to discuss the current season without highlighting the potential impacts of the El Nino phenomenon, which is beginning to hit some countries across the world. Besides Argentina, which typically benefits from improved moisture during El Nino, many major crop producers globally are vulnerable to hotter and drier weather, alongside livestock markets in Southeast Asia. The heat wave we mentioned earlier in Thailand is just one of many signs from the impending El Nino. That raises mortality rates for chickens and also lowers feeding appetite, which leads to lower broiler chicken weights. In Vietnam, El Nino has tightened the supply of Peruvian fish meal, which critically increases the input cost of Vietnamese aquaculture farmers. The industry is struggling to recoup these higher input costs due to an overproduction of shrimp, as farmers and feed millers had doubled down on the aquaculture industry after excellent margins in 2025, only to find that demand has not quite grown at the same rate in 2026. Wheat crops in India and Australia are at risk of receiving lower moisture in El Nino years, which reduces yields and also impacts quality. While in Brazil, El Nino may delay the rainy season, which will negatively impact the double crop system of beans and corn. Central and northeast regions in Brazil also face drought risks, while further down south, above normal rainfall is anticipated, which increases the risk of floods. Next slide, please. And now we come to the recent geopolitical developments that have shaped global logistics across multiple sectors, which are closely related to the feed grains industry. We saw that the US-Iran war didn't just cut off access to the Persian Gulf and hike oil prices, it also significantly disrupted the global fertilizer trade, as Edward mentioned earlier, and flows are still returning or attempting to return to pre-war levels. Here on the left, I've included an excerpt of an infographic produced by our team that illustrates the percentage of global fertilizer exports impacted by the Strait of Hormuz closure. Per the latest data from our analysts in S&P Global Sarah, sulfur exports from the region in June were 62% lower on year, while nitrogen and phosphates also experienced pretty significant declines. And while many importing nations have actually flocked to other producers outside the Middle East to meet their fertilizer supply needs, uh, part of that shortfall is simply being offset by using less fertilizers in some countries, such as Australia and Ukraine. So this could impact crop yields for the next season. It's also important to note here that fertilizer prices still remain elevated, even though they have come off their wartime highs. So this is tightening grower margins alongside strong energy prices. This may lead to higher crop prices as growers seek to recover higher costs paid for their farming inputs this season. While we have paid a lot of attention to the US-Iran war, tensions in the neighboring Red Sea are also far from over, and that could remain supportive of oil and energy prices in the near term. Oil refineries in the Middle East have become targets in recent strikes, and prolonged Hormuz shipping constraints may also weigh on refinery operation rates in the Middle East, and that reduces blending supplies for offshore buyers, which will be supportive of downstream products such as marine fuel, thereby raising the costs for shipping your grain. Next slide. And of course, rising tensions in the Black Sea have also been another source of logistical bottlenecks, especially for grains exports. Ukraine had been increasingly targeting energy infrastructure in Russia this year, which has impacted diesel availability for farming machinery, just as winter crop harvests were beginning in July. Both Russia and Ukraine have also been targeting port infrastructure and increasingly commercial vessels, impacting safe voyage at deep sea ports across both countries, as well as Danube River ports. The graphic you see on your left is another excerpt from one of our infographics that summarizes the recent attacks on Russian and Ukrainian ports and how both countries have been diverting their grain exports to other ports or neighboring countries, as more and more ship owners are refusing to send their ships and crew to load at Russia and Ukraine. However, neighboring ports will not have the capacity to absorb all of Ukraine and Russia's typical export volumes. They collectively represent 33% of the world's global wheat exports, which means global wheat prices remain vulnerable to a disruption in Russian and Ukraine exports, especially if the hostilities result in a full-scale halt of exports from Russia and Ukraine. Next slide. And because of this, feed grain procurement in Asia will likely remain at the mercy of logistics in the near term, particularly due to geopolitical issues in the Middle East and the Black Sea. The most immediate impact is on freight costs, which are exposed to volatile crude oil markets, while insurance costs remain elevated for voyages from the Black Sea or through the Middle East. Developments in the wider geopolitical environment and by extension, the freight market will very likely outweigh the impact of supply fundamentals on feed grain pricing in the near term. Well, one caveat to this is downstream demand, especially in the livestock sector, because as we mentioned earlier, pork and poultry sectors, for example, are both facing supply gluts in Asia, and that may weigh on demand for imported feed grains. Lastly, some grain exporters could still stand to benefit during this time of uncertainty. If there are further escalations in the Middle East and the Black Sea, we may start to see shippers and even buyers avoid origins that ship through the Suez Canal and the Black Sea. Feed buyers from Thailand, for example, have not allowed voyage through the Red Sea or loading in Russia and Ukraine in some of their feed wheat tenders. And other countries could follow suit if they perceive extraordinary shipping risks to these regions. This might drive buyers toward Indo-Pacific routes, which will benefit Australian, Canadian, and also US exporters who ship through Pacific Northwest ports. Would this result in a permanent shift in trade flows? That does appear unlikely for now, but a lot of it will certainly depend on the duration and severity of the conflicts in the Middle East and the Black Sea. Next slide. And with that, I've come to the end of our section. Here we've included some sample screenshots of the reports we produce across the grains, protein, as well as fertilizer space. And if you're interested to learn more about the range of our coverage, do feel free to reach out to myself or Edward or by sending us an email at the address below. With this, we'll now pass the time to Matthew. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivian. Thank you for your great presentations. Very informative. I'm just going to load up my presentation. I'll share this one. And we'll talk about some of the formulation aspects. There we go. Okay. We should now be able to see my presentation. Are we okay there, Jonathan?
Yes, it's okay.
Full speed now. Okay. So I'd like to take a look at how the current crisis is affecting how we formulate feeds, because it is the feed formulas that ultimately will give the demand for the commodities. And we've been through several crises, and I've been in the feed industry for over 40 years now, and we've had several crises. They're all of them different. And each time we come into a crisis, we have to adjust our strategies according to what we understand are the real core problems. And I'm going to compare a little bit to the pricing crisis we had in 2020 up to about 2022, because they may be apparently similar in some ways, but the fundamentals of the crisis are quite different. And we need to understand those fundamentals, how the different commodities are working in order to take corrective action. So current background, obviously we know the crude oil prices are swinging quite wildly. Availability is something of a problem, particularly in diesel. So processed crude oil products are a problem. These high oil prices, they might have an effect in the longer term of triggering more fuel production from food. Now, in the US, a lot of the soy oil, excuse me, is being diverted into diesel. And when we look at the corn processing in the US is remaining, fermentation is remaining fairly constant, about 45, 50 million tons. But there is an increasing use of spinning, centrifuging to remove the last drops of oil out of DDGS, because that has a premium in the market. So the fuel supply overall is quite unpredictable. At the beginning of the US-Iran war, we were seeing that the transport was severely affected in our region because diesel simply wasn't available. Now, there is some knock-on effect of the petrochemical market. We've seen from previous presentations it's affecting the urea and the fertilizers, of course, but it's also to a certain extent affecting the feed additive market. And some of our feed additives, notably methionine, are petrochemical dependent. So we have to treat these different amino acids differently because their supply chain is sensitive to different issues. Now, the fundamentals, though, if we look at the bulk commodities, they appear quite different to the sort of 2021, 2022 pricing, where we had big increases in the corn price and the soybean meal price and the fat price. That doesn't seem to be happening now. And our basic commodity prices, with reasonably good stock-to-use ratio and global harvests are looking good, those prices are looking reasonably stable and similar to 2020. Now, regional, what are we facing? There's a lot of differences between countries, a lot of government intervention. And this is giving major contrasts in the commodity prices between countries. The amino acids, especially D-L-methionine, are being directly affected by the Gulf crisis. We continue to keep those on our watch list. Inland transport is becoming, or has become, something of an issue. When diesel suddenly went short, that seems to have been corrected to an extent. We saw feed mills, a feed mill friend of mine in Australia, they had to stop production because they couldn't get wheat because the trucking company had no diesel. This is a very rare occurrence indeed. So there are knock-on effects of the fuel going into the feed industry, even in areas where there are plentiful raw materials. Moving them is an issue. And so the diesel crisis, we need to keep an eye on that. Okay, oops. Right, so 2022, what do we see? I'd like to put these side by side. We have wild commodity prices. And I use these in training exercises for feed formulation to teach people how to get through a crisis, how to adjust their strategies. Corn, soybean meal, feed fats all went up very, very heavily. In some cases, 180% off their baseline. The amino acids, on the other hand, in that crisis, remained fairly stable. They have a separate supply chain, separate supply and demand. The freight was available for these and relatively predictable in volumes compared to the surges we got in the commodity prices. Today, the base commodity prices, we'll see Vietnam as a good example, are close to 2020 levels. And these are close to production costs. So I doubt if they're going to go much lower because farmers tend not to release stocks if they're going to lose money unless they have to. Fuel appears to be the problem. And amino acids, we've seen some volatility in the last half of Q1 and Q2. That seems to have tempered down a little bit, and we get a slightly more predictable supply. Other strange things happening. China is a big buyer of soybeans, and they're buying more and more. The demand there is towards cooking oil, but they're crushing more soybeans than the soybean meal demand requires. So they are an exporter, net exporter of soybean meal, interestingly, and soybean meal in the market is very much a byproduct. Hence, it's very favorable pricing. Ethanol production said is going up in the US very slightly. Brazil is increasing capacity. As we look at the commodities themselves, we have to be aware that they are changing in chemical composition. DDGS is a good example. Back in the year 2000, we would get around about 10% oil in DDGS, but then the oil price started to go up. And that we're extracting by centrifuging, and the oil levels came down to about 6 or 7%. And now new equipment is going into the ethanol plants to squeeze out the last drop of oil because it is so valuable for biodiesel. So the technical profiles of some of these ingredients are changing in response to the price ratios out there in the market for proteins to energy and others. So the edible industrial and veg oil, they're big movers on the commodity pricing. Soybean meal, I say, is in a low, stable position for the time being. The fluctuation will probably come from the availability of freight and also the cost of fuel. So if we look at what happened last time, and show you this to show you it is different. This particular crisis, starting in 2020, was driven by COVID. So we need to understand what the underlying drivers are. And the problem with COVID was that there was no labor going into the plantations. We couldn't harvest the palm oil in Malaysia and Indonesia, so the prices went up. Then there was a kick-on effect a little bit later as the corn prices started going up due to shortage. And then with the Argentine and US soybean meal prices, they also started going up a little bit before the corn prices started to rise. So this was a challenged by labor in Southeast Asia, and then challenged by shortages of the major crops that were moving it. And there are obviously formulation techniques we can use to ameliorate some of these problems. But in many cases, unless the feed demand drops, we have to be price takers. And that price taking is still an issue in the amino acid supply, as we'll see. So if we look at what's happening now, the price ranges we've got so far this year, corn about $220 to $280 per metric ton. The figures down below are the figures in the price movements for Vietnam, actually. Soybean meal, very, very well priced there, $400 to $425 per metric ton. This reflects its position somewhat as a byproduct. And there is an interaction between the soybean meal price and the amino acid price, which is, I would say, helping to ameliorate the problems of the higher fluctuating amino acid levels. So we're seeing a somewhat similar situation to the beginning of 2020, except that the amino acid prices generally are lower than 2020, and we have more available types of amino acid to help us in the formulation. And this is helping us to reduce our protein demand in particular. So we have, I would say, quite a stable macro ingredient market there, which could be changed by the freight. Now we look at the pricing of the amino acids, and these are really quite, I would say, favorable. We look at lysine as a good indicator in China, roughly $870 a ton. Methionine, $4.20 of that order in China. This is somewhat on the high side. It has peaked around $6 to $8 in some cases, because when methionine runs short, the feedmills will scramble, but it's very inflexible in terms of price. Threonine, these are very good prices now. I can remember times when we were paying $8, $10 a kilo for threonine. Now we're paying less than $1 per kilo. This enables us actually to use a lot more amino acids in the feed. Now, Vietnam, we look at their pricing. The price of L-lysine, really due to the freight differentials, is a little higher. Methionine is about the same there compared to China, and the threonine is slightly higher. So on the international markets, these are not moving too far apart. Look at Indonesia, there's an example of a protected economy. The lysine is at least 50% higher. Methionine, excuse me, again, at least 50% higher, and threonine, roughly 50% higher. So we see some of the economies are disadvantaged on their input prices, but this has nothing to do with the available supply per se, but on the government policy that is restricting or attempting to restrict imports for whatever reason they feel is necessary. Well, here we've got some formulation examples. I thought I'd give you some live examples of formulation in action. And here's a starting formula for us to study. It's a broiler starter feed. On the left, we can see the nutrients. The nutrients in this feed are not going to change during this brief exercise. But on the right-hand side, you can see the commodities being used. And we can look at, say, the lysine, where I've got 0.286%, the methionine 0.299, and the threonine 0.113. Notice we're using a soybean meal of 28.117%. So this is a kind of starting scenario. And I've used some prices going back about 9 months, where lysine was a higher price. Methionine was quite a bit cheaper, almost half of what we're experiencing now. Threonine was 2,200. That's dropped by 50% at least now. Isoleucine coming in at 9,000, relatively difficult. And we have arginine at 6,400. Now, the supply side of these is easing, more production coming on, much better valuing the amino acids. So what happens when we have more of amino acid supply available to us in large quantities, lower prices? Well, this is bringing those prices up to date. Lysine, I've got there at $900 per ton. I have methionine. There we go. Methionine at $4 a kilo, threonine at 1,005, although that could come lower. Isoleucine 6, valine 4, and arginine 5,500. On the right in the circle, you can see the old levels. So we can see that the lysine has gone from 0.286%, it's got to 0.378. It's gone up considerably. And the interesting one here is methionine. So the methionine price has almost doubled from the previous solution to this one. And yet, because the other amino acids are cheap, we're getting less soybean meal in the solution, and therefore we're using more methionine, even though the price has gone up. Very interesting result there. Arginine is now cost-effective and coming into the formula. And the net effect of all of this is that our soybean meal has dropped from 28 down to 25%. So the more cost-effective form of the amino acid supply is in the amino acids themselves, the supplemental amino acids, and less so in the soybean meal, even though the pricing is so very attractive. So this gives us a clue as to what we can do if the prices of the amino acids go up. We can start to derive relatively more of our amino acids from the soybean meal. There is some flexibility there. But at the moment, I'd say current amino acid levels are going up. And we can see an effect on the left here. You see the crude protein level in the broiler feed has dropped from 21.9 to 21.13, indicating we're having a better balance and less wastage on digestible amino acids. So yes, when we're formulating these feeds, we need to keep a very good outlook on how much of the amino acids we might require in different price situations in order to plan our demand. Now, this is what happens to that same formula if the price of methionine doubles. And methionine is sensitive to the geopolitical situation for a number of reasons. But if it doubles and everything else remains constant, we still need the same amount of methionine. So methionine requirements are inflexible compared to price. And for those of you who are directly involved in feed milling, you will know that in the broiler area and the layer area, methionine is one of the things you must not run out of. It's very difficult to deal with a run out of methionine. So again, we have to keep referring to our formulation system for the current usage of amino acids because they can change. So we look at the effects on the methionine. Some major effects. They're more competitive than last year. Amino acid usage is up, which means the protein in formula is coming down, and soybean meal is decreasing. Formula crude protein is dropping. Environmentally, this is a good thing. The nitrogen utilization is better. Now, feeds cannot be produced without supplemental amino acids. I went through a mini crisis in Malaysia where we completely ran out of methionine, and the whole market had no available methionine available for sale. So in that case, we were facing a possibility of having to stop production because of lack of methionine. Fortunately, we found one. So what are the concerns of methionine? It's chemically synthesized. All the other amino acids come from fermentation. So the origins of the base chemicals come from petrochemical industry, generally speaking, and it's a global supply chain. Now, lysine and the others, they're fermented, and the production is local. Remember, I think it's about 68% of amino acids are produced in Southeast Asia, and because of that dependency of the methionine, you have a greater exposure to geopolitical risk. So international dependency on methionine, major issue. So amino acid for methionine is essential. One of the difficulties we have now is you can't guarantee the supply of your methionine by contract. So non-delivery because of, say, diesel shortage can happen, or congestion at port, something like that, which will be a force majeure. When that comes into operation, you just lose out on the supply chain. So whole markets, as I said, can run out. Now, in this sort of situation, I would advise we try to move away from the just-in-time policies we've been able to use in the past. I don't think it's workable when the supply chain is prone to this kind of disruption. These are essential to keep product moving forward. So let's take advantage and stock up on these key raw materials. It's possible that we can ameliorate the amino acid consumption with a bit more soybean meal usage to lower the amino acid supplementation. But that effect is going to be about 15 to 20% reduction in overall amino acid supplementation. Now we look at the country by country. I look at Vietnam. Well, I put Vietnam first because this is the country that is least troubled by import controls. Corn at the moment is rising rather high, $282 per ton. That's up from a base of about 220 in May. Feed millers there are stocking up, and the price has reflected that. Soybean meal is moving along very nicely, currently $411 per ton, unlikely to drop there unless there really is a substantial glut. So Vietnam is the cheapest in the region, cheaper even than Malaysia, which is generally very important. The consumption, 12.8 million tons of corn is imported annually. So they have a freight advantage. They can bring in large quantities and move it quickly. This is good. Soybean meal, there is local crushing, capacity of 7,800 tons a day. And this will be the largest crushing capacity in Southeast Asia. And it obviously helps them to produce fresh, cost-effective and high-performing soybean meal because of that freshness. Corn price, say, went to 220 in May and now 282. That's going up because the feedmills are stocking. On the US trade deal, a lot of noise, lots of MOUs, but the purchasing decisions, they are still on the way. Price competitive is the thing. We're not necessarily in Vietnam looking to meet MOU targets. It's all about competitiveness and price and availability. Formulation in wheat and corn, they came to parity in April. And in Vietnam is very quick to react to these price ratios. Wheat imports jumped 64%, and now they've come down and they're back to some sort of parity again now. Indonesia, when I was working in Indonesia, I was there when the first import ban came in, and my goodness, it caused disruption. And now we've had the same thing this year on soybean meal. And we can see that in April, all of the soybean meal was imported. Then in May, we have 45% went through the government trading house in Badakiri. And then now up to 78% in June, it will be moved to 100%. This exercise is costing a lot of money. There is a difference of about $61 per metric ton between what the original traders would charge and what the government is charging. It's had some other effects too, that the whole market now is not able to differentiate different qualities of soybean meal, which we believe is a big problem. Not all soybean meals are created equal. So Indonesia, the price signals of the market and the quality signals of the market are disappearing. So everything goes through Boticari. The feedmills with cash and storage, they have stocked up, of course, and they're drawing down that inventory. And those who have run out are paying the full premium now. So there is some scrambling for market position. It's very difficult to make money if you run out of soybean meal in Indonesia right now. One of the effects is that the buying decisions, we used to look forward at the CBOT to project what the price of the commodities might be. And we can't do that now in Indonesia. It will depend a lot on the local price, and that is rather difficult to fathom. So what has happened to the inclusion rates, and this is important to know, is that even though the prices have gone up, the inclusion rates of soybean meal have not changed very much. So the feed millers are still relying on the relatively high quality of the soybean meal as an amino acid source, and they're not taking a risk of lowering the proteins or lowering the soybean meal because that might compromise the broiler production. Feed costs are up, but unfortunately, the industry just has to swallow those. We look at the corn. Well, feed corn, it's up around 372. I think it's a bit of a tragedy when the CNF price is going to be about 220 if they were to buy. So there is a very big increase in the corn. The idea is this protects the local farmers and provides an income to the rural population. The lowest it went to is 347, which is still expensive, and a peak of over $400. At its worst, at the beginning of the policy of restriction, there were times when corn would have a price equal to that of soybean meal, which is really quite unusual. So corn in Indonesia, it's a different market. It's restricted for different regions. No feed corn imports at all, unlike soybean meal, which is imported through government agency. The CBOT prices really don't affect Indonesian prices at all because it's domestic harvest and availability and how much you can store is going to make the difference. Recovery isn't a supply problem. It's about restocking. That's where we're concerned about the pricing of corn. So the market is, I would say, functional. We've kind of got used to it in Indonesia, but the pricing is very high and it is completely disconnected from world market results. We look at next at our feed corn in Thailand. Again, this is a country that has regulations that is causing artificially high prices. In fact, the current price is 393, would be one of the highest in the region now. It's running 111 over the Vietnam price. Again, the restriction there has been caused by government policy in the main. So what is that policy about? If you want to buy a ton of imported corn, which is at a more favorable price, you have to buy 3 tons of local corn. So there is this very careful recording of what you buy locally gives you an entitlement to import. Now, unfortunately, this is further compounded by the requirements of the industry to fulfill the certification requirements in Europe for their exports. So the specification that we have to adhere to in Thailand is that the corn must be certified burn-free. And so that burn-free requirement is limiting the amount of corn that can be taken into the industrial feed sector. And it ends up with those 2 limitations giving a higher cost of corn in Thailand than any other market. So international compliance in this case is one of their problems in the supply chain. Thailand can still import corn, but it's highly restricted. The 3-to-1 rule we've looked at, the burn-free certification is required, but what this does is to shrink the supplier pool and make the restriction in the market worse than it needs to be. And there is a huge amount of paperwork involved in this. Those of you who've been in the industry a long time will know that the burden of paperwork and certification is getting ever more expensive. I haven't seen a year in the last 20 where it's become easier. And so the compliance, the paperwork, the traceability are, I think, holding back the industry in terms of its cost effectiveness on an international stage when it comes to producing livestock products for export. This, of course, has been compounded. Corn went up in I think it was in May in Thailand because of the Hormuz strike. So this was one market that is exposed to a certain extent by CBOT. But what they're saying in Thailand now is that the supply security is just about as important as the price of commodities nowadays, because of the real risk of running out of commodities is there, and that is catastrophic for business if it happens. Philippines feed corn, again a protected market, and we can see the current price of 382 is high. It has been down to 320, but that's still $100 above the international market. It's been over $400, and now the imported corn is cheaper than the local. Now, the imported corn is thought to have a higher mycotoxin content compared to the local. So there is still a premium on the local, but nonetheless, the wet season quality corn is not yet upon us, and it's going to start coming through very soon. So the Philippines is actually improving. Again, we had an exposure to the price of the activity in Hormuz. Imported corn is cheaper than local. But that's a temporary window until the price is equivalent again. Price discovery is interesting in the Philippines. It's not the the consumers, the feedmillers, who are dictating the price. The traders got a position of considerable power, and they will call the price out. So it's not a market where price signaling, telegraphing is particularly important, particularly functional, I would say. What the Filipino nutritionists are doing is to use enzymes and other feed enhancers more effectively or higher levels to be able to get more nutrients out of say the corn and the soybean meal than they could previously. And this is one good way of responding to sustained cost pressure on the feed ingredients. So optimizing the efficiency of the ingredient usage is an effective way forward. It seems to be more of an issue in the Philippines, who feel under more pressure. So we look at the final thoughts here. Supply reliability. This is becoming a major thing. Runouts of ingredients, if you've ever experienced them, unfortunately, you have to shut your factory doors. So we're focusing on making sure our businesses keep running. There's more risk in the microingredients at the moment. Amino acids, they can spontaneously disappear. Methionine is one of the culprits. Price elasticity is a problem. And say on the methionine, if the price of methionine goes up, there's very little choice but to follow that price upwards to maintain supply. Global supply, the basic supply, is comfortable, but that doesn't mean that procurement is easy because the freight, the availability, and that kind of problem is there. In Southeast Asia, government policy is really causing some, I'd say, distortion of feed manufacturing costs. Indonesia, the big premiums due to the government policies. Thailand, they a little bit more free, but there's a compliance issue following the requirements of the overseas markets. And the Philippines and Vietnam, they are doing reasonably well, but still in the Philippines the prices are higher. So what's changing? We used to follow CBOT very carefully, and in Malaysia, Vietnam, we still can to a large extent. The signals used to work. Global stocks to use used to work, but global stocks to use can run into irrelevance if there is a problem on the logistics, and it's not so much a logistic capacity, but whether or not the logistic channels can actually flow due to the war experience. So the CBOT is not well correlated these days to what's going to happen to the price of ingredients in the feed mill. And so what are we concerned about these days? It is the price intelligence of what's happening locally inside a country that is going to affect these purchasing decisions. And the CBOT is a kind of backup behind that. And we think it's more and more important to understand regional, local situations with more detail in making the assessments. So with that, I thank you very much. And I pass back to the moderators. We can take a look at some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Vivian and Edward for your presentations. So now we are moving into the Q&A sessions. Okay, Matthew, I think you can stop sharing now. So I will go into the Q&A.
Oh, yes, sure. Thank you.
Yeah. So I will address the first question first to, okay, China's coverage really drops off from November. Most of the demand is still uncovered, and Brazil still seems to be the preferred choice, even with the US commitment in place. Does that mean China's just pacing itself to stay compliant on paper while actually buying wherever is cheaper? So if so, how much can we really count on that US-China flow staying steady into maybe next year?
Okay, I can take this question. I think the question is regarding soybeans purchases by China. So yes, China is kind of hasn't really completed its coverage. They are still quite open for I think November to January. I showed my slides just now. But the issue is actually there is an issue where US soybeans are considerably more expensive currently than the Brazilian soybeans. So I think that's what you're trying to ask, right? You're trying to ask whether they are going to favor the US even though they're more expensive. So there is two issues. One is the people or the institutions that are buying US soybeans are mainly state-owned enterprises. And the state-owned enterprises, they're buying for for the reserves, also for some geopolitical reasons. So that is not really they do not involve too much of price, the topic of price. Whereas the private soybean crushers themselves, they are mainly favoring the Brazilian soybeans because of the pricing. So that is currently what we are seeing at the moment. And also, there's another issue where China is also not really that short on soybeans. So I think their crushing right now is about 2 million or over 2 million metric tons per week. And they are also auctioning some of these soybeans through Sino-grain auctions. So these are actually some of the factors that are influencing or kind of show that, yes, China might actually start purchasing more soybeans going to the November, December shipment window. Also, we need to consider that in September, President Trump will be meeting Xi Jinping. So there might be some new development that we cannot say for sure whether they will buy a lot of soybeans suddenly, but that is something that, we have to wait until it happens to see the development. Yeah. So that's the response to this question.
Okay, thank you, Edward. We'll go to the next questions again. Okay, before we go to the next questions, if anyone still have questions, you can type in the Q&A box. So let's, I think these questions, okay. For fertilizer cost increase, when would that actually show up as tighter grain supply to the market?
I'll take that question. So in terms of the current winter crops, so we're just talking about this in terms of, I guess, the feed grains that we covered earlier, wheat, corn, beans, probably more on the wheat and corn side. For crops that are harvesting now, so for example, in the Black Sea and, and Europe, um, there is limited impact, given that they would have covered most of their fertilizer needs before the war happened, or well, before it kind of imploded in February. For other countries that harvest later or for spring crops in the next year, so for example, Australia's winter crop, which will harvest in October to November, and also other spring wheat crops, it's likely that we might see some reductions. I wouldn't say all of that would be driven by, fertilizer, like lesser fertilizer usage alone, though that certainly plays a part. Um, in some of these countries, already less wheat is being planted. Um, Partially in favor of other crops that simply, had better export premiums. So that is also a second factor. But we think in terms of when that will actually show up as tighter grain supply, uh, probably sometime later this year or early next year. But again, as we also mentioned in the presentation earlier, there are very strong carryouts of grain from many exporters. So they do have that supply to tap on for exports in the coming season. So we don't think it's going to be a situation where, the world runs out of grain to buy from. In fact, we think actually the bigger hurdle will actually be what is happening in, I think, in the Black Sea and how disruptive it will be to their grain exports. Yep.
Okay, thank you. Okay, next questions I think is direct to Matthew. So is from Mr. Mukhtar Sulaiman. So facing the agricultural supply chain from farm productions to feed formulations, and where do you see the greatest opportunity for technological innovations?
Well, that's a good question. I think what we're continuing to do is to understand the lowering crude protein in diets. So we are getting more and more dependent on a wider range of amino acids to supplement our feeds, and I think that's what's exciting us at the moment. Um, Other technological advances, I think we're getting better at understanding NIR capability. And with that, we get more accurate ideas of what the ingredient compositions are, and we can formulate more accurately and more regularly. I think in the future we're going to have, I believe, much closer cooperation between agronomy, uh, grain trade, and usage in the feed mill. Ideally, that's what will happen. That's how I see it moving.
Okay. The next questions, I think there are two questions, it's quite similar. I will put it together and put it to Matthew. So there's one is talking about amino acids. If the adding more amino acids barely moves the cost, I mean, based on the feed formulations that you showed just now, should feed mills be leaning on to reduce corn or soybean meal they need? And how far can they actually push amino acid to replace soybean meal before it starts hurting the growth or FCR?
Oh, good question. Um, the quick answer to that is we don't know for sure. But what's happened in the last, I'd say, 3 or 4 years is that we have good supplies of arginine, isoleucine, valine. The price is coming down, and we're able to use these at higher levels in the feed and reduce our crude proteins further. A limiting factor in the past has been the arginine and the histidine allowance, but we're coming close to a point, I think, where some of what we used to call non-essential amino acids are now conditionally essential. I'm thinking of serine in the broiler feeds. Although the chicken can manufacture serine, it can't manufacture enough. So part of the technology we will be looking at in this case will be to see how far down can the amino acid pool go before we run into problems. So we still need to evaluate that. There are some challenges that getting low crude protein diets is more difficult in wheat-based than corn-based diets. We're not quite sure why, but if you have a corn-based formula, you can go down maybe 1% lower in crude protein compared to a wheat-based formula. We need to understand that better. I think we will have a change in the formulation methodology that we'll be starting to formulate on total amino acids rather than protein, because the total amino acid is a substrate for other amino acid manufacture to a certain extent. So dynamic, still learning, still getting better.
Thank you, Matthew. I think there are a lot of questions to you. I will take another questions. Okay. For all the explanations, Indonesia has more difficult positions uh, on the, I mean, since the regulations on fertilizers, whether the higher price of amino acids. What do you think?
Well, having worked in Indonesia, we try not to think about it, to be honest. We know we're at a disadvantage. Formulation methodology is slightly different. Everything is more expensive. Everything. So what that means is our formula price ratios are roughly the same as if we had no government intervention. So the formulas are relatively easy to produce. When the corn restrictions first came in, the price of corn shot above the price of soybean meal, which was unthinkable. But then later it dropped off a little bit, and formulas reverted to normal. I would say with the high price of soybean meal in Indonesia, care on the amino acids is still an important thing. Although the amino acids are more expensive in Indonesia, they still represent very good value compared to even a year ago. So that will be where I would take my formulas in Indonesia.
Sure, sure. So
Yeah.
I think this already answered the two questions or so. So I
Mm.
think we go to the final questions. Considering the high price levels of methionine now, are there any alternative products that you use to reduce its usage in the formulation?
To be honest, not really. We have to look at some of the potential difficulties of methionine being used as a methyl donor. So we make sure there's the right amount of choline chloride. We can use betaine. Excuse me, what customers are generally doing now is nibbling down their methionine requirements in the formula until they see a detectable change in the growth rates. So in the past, we've had the luxury situation of being able to put in a bit of safety margin in our formulas. The trend is to take those out. So the first stage is to reduce your safety margins until you reach a point where there is some sort of detectable change happening. But there are no easy ways of sparing methionine that I know of. What we would do, I think, is to make a feed that is lower in amino acid concentration. That will help to a certain extent, but then the chickens will eat more of it. So unfortunately with methionine, my main point is we have to have adequate stocks and we have to pay the price.
Okay, thank
Yeah,
you.
pleasure.
Sorry, there's one more questions coming in from Matthew. So we
Mm.
still have about few minutes. So let's go through it again. Uh, so Indonesia, based on your data radar, would you share another alternative protein source that now looks increasing imported due to the SPM policy? So except of synthetic amino
Oh.
acids, which alternative protein source will be more relevant and cheaper for both layer and broiler formulation?
Okay, that's an interesting question because as soon as we have problems on the amino acids and the proteins, um, the whole global community of nutritionists starts looking for alternative feed ingredients. Now, the problem is there aren't very many of them in significant quantities. So the alternative ingredients exist, but unfortunately, in such small quantities and under research that we can't use them very well. Having said that, I think there is scope for these very, very low oil DDGS and some of the higher protein DDGS to be used. Corn, surprisingly, is a big contributor to the methionine and cysteine status of feed. I think it's 18% of a broiler feed is the methionine is supplied by corn. So corn is not a bad substitute to boost the methionine supplementation. The American technology is moving towards further extraction, removal of the carbohydrate, higher corn protein content of the DDGS, which is good. It does, to a certain extent, spare methionine. The good news is that out of the US, there's something like 45 to 50 million tons of DDGS available, which is great news because it's a byproduct that can be found in significant quantities. So that would be my move. Corn gluten meal, good. DDGS is emerging as a methionine sparing agent, I would say.
Okay, thank you. I think that's all for today. Before we go, this webinar will be recorded and it will be uploaded on efilling.com. But we will also send an email to everyone, to all the attendees, to update that once it's uploaded, as well as we will provide the answers to the questions as well on PDF format to send to everyone. And if you still have further questions, please you can email to eFilling, and we will actually send to either Matthew, Edward, or Vivian to answer it and reply to you. So that's all for today, and thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us today again. Bye bye.